Welcome to the second part of today's lecture, in which I talk about photography as a social document. In the first part, we talked about difference between recording and reforming reality. Recording reality meaning taking a photograph without any alteration, which we had examples of portrait and landscape manias, in which people were interested in exactly what the reality looked like. And then reforming reality, whose goal was to report on what was wrong with the world in order to make a change. And in the first part, we talked about early war photography. I wanted to continue the discussion about reforming reality by introducing early social documentarians. One of photographers who was included in this new wave of early social documentarians was Jacob Riis, who immigrated from Denmark at the age of 21. He was one of 15 kids and he experienced poverty firsthand. When he moved to New York, he lived in the slums of New York. In 1877, he became a police reporter and he documented the scandalous conditions of immigrants in the Lower East Side in Manhattan. And I wanted to read to you a little quote that will explain to you what those conditions were. In the 1880s, 334,000 people were crammed into a single square mile of the Lower East Side, making it the most densely populated place on Earth. They were packed into filthy, disease-ridden tenements, 10 or 15 to a room, and the well-off knew nothing about them and cared less. Now, in the 1880s, many people in upper and middle class society were unaware of the dangerous conditions in the slums among poor immigrants. And Jacob Riis, being one of the poor immigrants who lived in those slums on Lower East Side, took upon himself to take the images and expose the conditions in that area of New York. Now, in order to understand a little bit more what the immigration situation was like, I wanted to just say a couple of words. After the Civil War, the country transformed into an industrial power and became largely urban. A wave of unskilled Southern and Eastern Europeans, Asians, and Jewish immigrants came to settle in the promised land of the United States. Now, this immigrant migration was vastly different from the previous booms due to the influx of non-Western European and non-Protestant individuals, therefore making the split between the new and the old immigrants much larger. In the 1880s, over 5 million immigrants came to the US, with many of these people staying in New York. This increased New York City's population by 25%, making the tenement problem much more extreme. So Riis was taking photographs for years in Lower East Side, and he published the book How the Other Half Lives in 1890, with which he wanted to expose the conditions in the slums of New York. And that was his way of reforming reality. The importance of the book was that it was the first documentary photography book. And these are some of the images that he had taken. Now, Jacob Riis, again, was someone who lived in Lower East Side, in the slums of Lower East Side, where all of the immigrants came and stayed. So he was pretty much, through the images, telling his own story. He was personally familiar with the conditions there. And this is an interesting photograph, and I will read to you a little quote how this photograph was made. To capture the dim tenement interiors that so shocked his audience, Riis employed a new flash powder, which resulted in the often startled expressions of the people he photographed and the depiction of interiors with harsh lights and shadows that may have exaggerated their actual appearance. Riis took the image below in a crowded tenement room, where single males paid 5 cents a spot for a night's lodging. Riis entered this space with the help of the landlord, who received assurances that he would not be prosecuted for running an illegal lodging house. Riis also needed the cooperation of the sleeping subjects, who had to appear to be awakened by his flash. In order to create this appearance, Rees had to have them pose with their faces towards the camera and then hold still while he ignited his flash powder and made the exposure. Now you can see again, we are looking at an image that was posed by the photographer. It was not just taken or found in the world. He designed it. He told people where to stay, where to look, and how to behave. So the norm of what was acceptable in documentary photography at the time was not the same as it is today. And these are some of the images that he had taken. Now, as you're looking at the images, I just wanted to remind you again that they were taken by a photographer who lived in this particular place. And the goal of this book was to expose the horrible conditions in that part of New York, to, in a way, reform their reality. Another early social documentarian was Louis Hine, and he was part of the American wave of social reform. One of the projects that he did, he photographed immigrants on Ellis Island in 1904, and between 1890 and 1920, 70% of all immigrants who came to the US came through Ellis Island. And these are some of the images that he had taken. What Hine also did, he photographed children working in the US factories prior World War I. He collected information on each child he photographed, such as their name, age, height, weight, nature of work, how long they had been on the job, if they had any work-related injuries, and so forth. What is so important here, which is what social documentarian is all about, that the photographs were instrumental in changing the child labor laws in the United States. So he really succeeded in reforming that reality. What is interesting that in order to gain access to the factories and get the images, he posed as fire inspector, Bible salesman, and so forth. Now, by looking at these images, we can see how shocking it is for a 10, 11, or 12-year-old to work in a factory full-time, long hours, something that would be inconceivable today. And then finally, I wanted to introduce Farm Security Administration in 1930s. In 1935, President Franklin Roosevelt created Resettlement Administration, whose purpose was to help poor rural Americans who were uprooted from their farms during the 1930s Great Depression and forced to move to urban areas to find jobs. As part of the effort, Roy Stryker hired a handful of photographers, many of which are really extremely known documentary photographers today. He hired them to showcase the Resettlement Administration's work and American rural life during and after the Great Depression. What is interesting is that photographers were advised to dramatize and idealize real subjects in their actual environment, delivering a specific cultural message so the viewers would formulate a favorable response to the government programs. Similar to early war photographers, it was kind of a propaganda. And one of the photographers included in Farm Security Administration was Dorothea Lange. She studied photography with Clarence White, who is photosecessionist who opened the first photography school. And what is interesting is that she photographed with a large format camera, which we know was a clunky, big camera, not so easy to use. And she had a permanent limb from polio that she conducted as a child. She had a history of being a social documentarian because before joining the FSA, she photographed unemployed laborers, forgotten men in labor strikes, and street demonstrations. And these are some of the images that she had taken. And you can see the goal here was again to expose what was wrong with the world in 1930s, the effect of the Great Depression and people being relocated from rural areas to urban areas. Another photographer who worked for Farm Security Administration was Walker Evans, who is one of the most important American photographers, and he's known for his objective 8x10 large format camera pictures that follow the tradition of capturing images that showed exactly what the viewer would have seen had he been there himself. He took clinical, unheroic recordings of ignored scenes from a fading American culture in the rural South during and after Great Depression. And these are some of the images that he had taken. And you can see that the images are not of a conventionally beautiful subject matter, but what Walker Evans did through composition, through working with the subject matter, he was able to create stunning photographs, such as this one of a very simple interior, but beautifully composed. So this is the end of today's lecture in which we talked about photography as a social document, and make sure to follow further instructions on Blackboard.